The train's whistle had long faded into the distance, swallowed by the howling wind that swept across the empty platform. Clara May Rutledge stood alone, her worn leather satchel clutched in both hands, watching the last wisp of smoke disappear into the gray winter sky. The conductor hadn't even waited for her to fully step down before signaling the engineer to move on. Time was money, and the railroad had no patience for a young woman fumbling with her belongings in the snow. Pine Hollow stretched before her, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the Montana cold like cattle seeking shelter. The December wind cut through her thin wool coat, finding every gap in the threadbare fabric. She'd mended it 3 times already, but there was only so much needle and thread could do against winter's assault. Clara pulled the letter from her pocket, careful to shield it from the swirling snow. The ink had begun to fade from repeated handling during the 2-day journey from Kansas City, but she could still make out the words "position secured," "room and board included," "report to Mrs. Elmira Hutchinson at the Travelers' Rest Inn upon arrival." She tucked the letter away and lifted her chin, forcing her shoulders back despite the cold seeping into her bones. 23 years old, orphaned just 2 months prior when consumption finally claimed her mother, and now standing in a town where she knew not a soul, but she'd survived worse. The bruises from her uncle's drunken rages had faded, though the memory of why she'd fled Kansas still made her flinch. The main street of Pine Hollow was nearly deserted. A few horses stood tethered to posts, their heads low against the wind, ice forming on their manes. Lamplight glowed weakly through frost-covered windows, promising warmth she couldn't reach. Clara's boots, already worn thin at the soles, slipped on the icy boardwalk as she made her way toward the center of town. The Travelers' Rest Inn sat on the corner, a 2-story building that might have been impressive once but now sagged under the weight of neglect. Paint peeled from its sign, and one shutter hung at an odd angle, creaking in the wind. Clara paused at the door, smoothing her dark hair back under her bonnet and brushing snow from her shoulders. First impressions mattered, her mother had always said. She knocked, waited, then knocked again. The door finally opened to reveal a thin man with suspicious eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. "We're full up," he said before she could speak. "I'm Clara Rutledge. I'm expected Mrs. Hutchinson hired me as Mrs. Hutchinson sold out 2 weeks ago." The man started to close the door. "I'm Bart Henley, new owner. Don't know nothing about no hired girl." Clara's hand shot out, catching the door. "But I have a letter. She promised room and board and wages for housekeeping work." Henley's laugh was harsh as crows cry. "That's between you and her. Then, like I said, we're full up. Try the saloon down the street. Sometimes they take in strays." The door slammed shut, leaving Clara staring at peeling paint and rusted hinges. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the thundering of her heart. 2 months of planning, of selling everything that wouldn't fit in her satchel, of believing she finally had a chance at something better, all of it crumbling like old paper in the snow. A shiver ran through her, violent enough to rattle her teeth. She couldn't stand here. Movement was warmth, and warmth was survival. Clara turned away from the inn, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes that had nothing to do with the wind. The saloon Henley mentioned was easy to find raucous laughter and piano music spilled onto the street despite the early hour. Clara hesitated at the swinging doors. She knew what kind of work might be offered to a desperate woman in a place like this. Her mother would roll in her grave, but her mother had never been alone in a strange town with night falling and nowhere to go. She pushed through the doors. The warmth hit her like a wall, thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned her way. A woman traveling alone was unusual. A woman entering a saloon alone was either brave or foolish or something else entirely. Well. The bartender, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, set down the glass he was polishing. "You lost, miss." "I'm looking for work," Clara said, forcing her voice steady. "Honest work. Cooking, cleaning, mending." Someone snickered. Another man called out something crude that made her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes on the bartender. He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Try somewhere else. This ain't the place for what you're looking for." Clara nodded once and turned to leave, ignoring the catcalls that followed her exit. Outside, the cold struck again, harder now that she'd had a taste of warmth. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered mountains purple and orange. Beautiful, if she'd had the luxury of appreciating it. She tried the general store next. The proprietor's wife took one look at her and crossed her arms. "We don't need help." The bakery was closing for the day. The owner, Flour still dusting his apron, at least had the decency to look apologetic. "Times are hard. Miss, can barely keep my own family fed. You might try the church." The church? Clara almost laughed. She'd sat in too many pews, listening to sermons about charity and kindness, only to watch those same Christians turn away from actual need. But desperation left little room for pride. The small Methodist church sat at the end of the main street, its white steeple barely visible through the falling snow. Clara knocked at the parsonage door, teeth chattering now despite her best efforts to control them. The minister's wife answered, a plump woman with kind eyes that hardened the moment she took in Clara's appearance, travel-stained dress. No wedding ring, satchel that marked her as a drifter. "Please," Clara began. "I just need somewhere to stay for the night. I can work." "I'm sorry." The woman didn't sound sorry at all. "We can't take in everyone who comes begging. There's a establishment 2 towns over that might be more suitable for your situation." The door closed with quiet finality. Clara stood on the step, understanding perfectly what kind of establishment the woman meant. Anger flared hot in her chest, warming her momentarily. These good Christian folk, so quick to judge, so slow to help. Full darkness had fallen by the time Clara admitted defeat. She'd tried every business on Main Street, knocked on doors of houses until someone threatened to call the sheriff. Her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves, and she'd stopped feeling her toes an hour ago. At the edge of town, she spotted an old lumber shed, abandoned by the look of it. The door hung open, snow drifting through gaps in the walls, but the roof seemed mostly intact. It would have to do. Clara stumbled inside, muscles stiff with cold. Empty grain sacks lay scattered on the floor, and she gathered them into a makeshift bed in the corner most sheltered from the wind. Her satchel became a pillow. She pulled her coat tighter, tucked her skirts around her legs, and curled into the smallest ball possible. The shivering came in waves now, each one stealing more of her strength. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. "Chin up, Clara May. We don't let the world see us cry." "I'm trying, Mama," she whispered to the darkness. "I'm trying." The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, sending snow swirling around her makeshift shelter. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. Clara pressed her face into the musty grain sacks and finally, let the tears come. They froze on her cheeks almost instantly, tiny crystals of defeated hope. She'd been so certain this was her chance, a respectable position, honest work, a new start far from the reaching hands and drunken breath of her uncle. Instead, she was spending her first night in Pine Hollow the same way she'd spent too many nights in Kansas cold, alone and invisible to those who had the power to help. But she was still breathing, still fighting. Tomorrow, she'd try again. Tonight, she just had to survive. The shed offered little protection from the dropping temperature. Clara dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time the wind gusted particularly hard. Her dreams were fragments, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, the smell of bread from better days, the warmth of a fire she couldn't quite reach. When she woke for good, she couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. The cold had settled deep in her bones, making movement agony. This was how people died. She knew, quietly, forgotten. becoming just another cautionary tale about drifters who couldn't make it through winter. Clara forced herself to sit up, to flex her fingers and toes. Pain meant life. She wouldn't give Pine Hollow the satisfaction of finding her frozen corpse come morning. There had to be something, somewhere, someone who would see past a missing wedding ring and worn clothes to the capable hands and strong back underneath. The temperature continued to drop as the night wore on, and Clara knew with grim certainty that she might not see morning if she stayed in the drafty shed. But where could she go? Every door in town had closed in her face. Every offer of Christian charity had come with conditions she couldn't meet. She thought of the saloon again, of the knowing looks and crude suggestions. Would it be so bad just for one night, just for warmth? Her mother's voice rose in protest, but her mother had never been this cold, this alone, this close to simply disappearing into the Montana winter. No. Clara pressed her face into her hands, feeling the ice crystals on her eyelashes. Not yet. Not that. She'd rather freeze with her dignity intact than thaw with it sold. So she waited, and shivered, and endured, as the wind outside sang its lonely song through the empty streets of Pine Hollow. Dawn came like a reluctant visitor, pale and cold through the cracks in the shed walls. Clara uncurled herself slowly, every joint protesting the movement. Her fingers were swollen inside her gloves, and she had to work them carefully before attempting to stand. The grain sacks beneath her were stiff with frost from her own breath. She stumbled to the shed door and pushed it open, squinting against the white glare of fresh snow. Pine Hollow looked almost peaceful in the early morning light, smoke rising from chimneys of homes where people had slept warm and safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. Clara shook out her skirts, trying to restore some semblance of respectability to her appearance. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the night, and she did her best to tuck it back under her bonnet with numb fingers. If she was going to beg for work again, she needed to look capable, not desperate, though the distinction felt increasingly meaningless. The main street was empty, save for a few early risers. A man loading his wagon gave her a curious look but said nothing. Clara kept her head high, fighting the urge to hunch against the cold. Each breath sent sharp pains through her chest, and she knew she needed to find warmth soon or risk genuine illness. The bakery would be opening, perhaps in the morning light. With fresh perspective, the owner might reconsider. Clara made her way to the familiar door, stamping her feet on the step to restore circulation. The baker, Mr. Hoffman, she'd learned his name was just pulling the first loaves from the oven. The smell made her stomach clench. She hadn't eaten since the meager meal on the train yesterday morning. "Please," she said when he noticed her at the door. "I'll work just for bread. I can clean, help with the baking. My mother taught me to make the finest dinner rolls in Kansas." He paused, flour-dusted hands on his apron. For a moment, she thought he might relent. Then his expression hardened. "Look, Miss, word's already spreading about you. A young woman, traveling alone, no husband, no family. Folk are saying you might be—" He cleared his throat. "Running from something, or someone. We can't afford that kind of trouble." "I'm not running from anything," Clara said firmly, though it wasn't entirely true. "I came here for honest work that fell through. That's all." "Maybe so." He turned back to his ovens. "But I've got a wife and daughters. Can't have people talking." Clara left without another word. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone, probably that gossipy minister's wife, had started spreading assumptions about her character. In a small town like Pine Hollow, reputation was currency, and hers had been spent before she'd earned it. She tried the dressmaker next, a spinster named Miss Abigail Thornton, who ran a small shop near the church. Surely another unmarried woman would understand her situation. Miss Thornton looked up from her sewing, spectacles perched on her nose. "I heard about you," she said before Clara could speak. "The whole town's talking." "And what are they saying?" Clara kept her voice level. "That you're either a runaway wife or worse." The woman's needle never paused in its steady rhythm. I've worked 20 years to build my reputation here. I won't risk it for a stranger. I'm neither of those things. I'm just looking for work. Then you should have come with references. Or a wedding ring, or family. Miss Thornton's tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. That's how the world works, dear, especially for women. Clara left the shop, her last hope fading with the morning light. She'd tried every establishment, every possibility. The rooming houses wouldn't take her without payment up front. The married women wouldn't hire her for fear of their husbands' wandering eyes. The men wouldn't hire her without expecting something more than honest labor. By midday, hunger had become a living thing gnawing at her insides. She paused at the horse trough to break the ice and cup water in her hands, ignoring the stares of passers-by. The cold liquid hit her empty stomach like a fist, but it was something. That's quite a sight. The voice belonged to a woman emerging from the mercantile. Mrs. Downing, based on the way others greeted her. She was the kind of woman who wore her respectability like armor-pressed dress, perfect hair, wedding ring displayed prominently. Clara straightened, water still dripping from her chin. I beg your pardon. A young woman drinking from the horse trough like an animal. Mrs. Downing's lip curled. Though I suppose that's what comes of traveling alone, trying to seduce other women's husbands with sob stories. I've done no such thing. Clara's voice came out stronger than she felt. Haven't you making eyes at every man in town, begging at decent folks' doors? The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. We know your type. Best move along before the sheriff decides you're a vagrant. Clara watched her sweep away, skirts held high above the muddy snow. Rage burned hot in her chest, momentarily driving out the cold. These people, these good Christian people with their warm homes and full bellies, so quick to judge what they couldn't understand. But anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. It burned energy she didn't have, distracted from the immediate problem of survival. Clara forced herself to think practically. She'd exhausted the town proper. Perhaps the outskirts held possibilities, farms that might need help, less respectable establishments that couldn't afford to be choosy. She walked until Pine Hollow shrank behind her, following a rutted road that wound between snow-covered fields. Her boots were soaked through now, feet numb beyond pain. Every so often, she passed a farmhouse, but the dogs that ran out barking discouraged closer approach. By late afternoon, she'd circled back toward town from the other direction. The abandoned lumber shed beckoned again, but she knew another night there might be her last. Her fingers had taken on a waxy appearance she recognized as dangerous, and violent shivers came in waves that left her gasping. On the very edge of town, where respectable folks rarely ventured, sat a ramshackle building everyone pretended didn't exist, the Paradise boarding house, though everyone knew it boarded more than travelers. Clara had noticed it earlier but avoided it, clinging to standards that seemed increasingly foolish. She stood outside for a long moment, watching painted women lean from upstairs windows, calling to men below. Was this what she'd come to? Her mother had worked her fingers bloody as a seamstress to keep them respectable. All those years of careful virtue, guarded reputation. For what? But even as she climbed the steps, she knew she couldn't do it. Not this, not yet. The madam, a hard-faced woman named Rosie, took one look at her and laughed. Honey, you're pretty enough, but you've got that good girl shine all over you. Come back when you're hungrier. Clara found herself back on the street, almost grateful for the rejection. Almost. As darkness fell again, she made her way to the only shelter she knew, the lumber shed. But when she arrived, she found it occupied. 2 drifters had claimed her corner, passing a bottle between them. They looked up with interest as she hesitated in the doorway. Well, well, company's always welcome, sweetheart. Clara backed away quickly, their laughter following her into the night. Even this last miserable refuge was denied her now. She wandered the empty streets, no longer trying to maintain any pretense of dignity. Her wet skirts dragged in the snow, and she'd long since stopped feeling her feet. This was how it ended. Then, not dramatically, but slowly, ignored by a town full of people who could help but wouldn't. At the end of an alley, she found a small overhang behind the feed store, just deep enough to shelter her from the worst of the wind. Clara sank down against the wall, drawing her knees to her chest. She was too tired to cry, too cold to care about the impropriety of her position. "Mama," she whispered, "I tried. I really tried." The stars emerged one by one in the clear winter sky, beautiful and indifferent. Clara watched them through increasingly heavy eyelids. She'd heard freezing wasn't the worst way to go, just like falling asleep. They said. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Horses stamped in their stalls. The town settled into its evening routines, warm light glowing from windows she'd never see the inside of. And Clara May Rutledge, 23 years old, alone in the world, curled tighter into herself and waited for whatever morning would or wouldn't bring. The cold had become something beyond sensation now, a presence that filled her entirely. She'd stopped shivering, a bad sign. She knew dimly. Her thoughts came slow and strange. Her mother was there, telling her to get up, to keep fighting. But her mother was dead, buried in Kansas soil, and Clara was so very tired. She closed her eyes, no longer able to keep them open. Let them find her in the morning. Let them feel guilty, these good people of Pine Hollow, or let them feel nothing at all. She was past caring. The night deepened. Snow began to fall again, softly, covering her still form in a gentle shroud. And somewhere in the darkness beyond town, a lone rider made his way home, unaware that his life was about to intersect with a stranger who'd given up on waiting for kindness from a cold world. Jonas Merrick guided his horse through the darkness, the wagon wheels creaking under the weight of fresh-cut timber. He'd stayed too long in the forest, lost in the rhythm of axe against wood, the simple clarity of physical labor that kept darker thoughts at bay. Now the moon was high, and Buttercup, his old mare, picked her way carefully along the frozen road back to town. He preferred these late returns, when Pine Hollow's judgmental eyes were closed behind shutters and he could pass through unnoticed. 3 years since Martha and the children had been taken by scarlet fever, and still the widows paraded their daughters past him after church. Still the men suggested it was time he moved on, as if grief were something to be scheduled, packed away when convenient. Buttercup snorted, her breath clouding in the cold air, and stopped suddenly. Jonas frowned, peering ahead into the darkness. The mare had good instincts. She'd warned him of wolves, bears, and once a mountain cat. But her ears were pricked forward with curiosity, not laid back in alarm. "What is it, girl?" He climbed down from the wagon, boots crunching in the fresh snow. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled against the back wall of Henderson's feed store. So still she might have been a discarded grain sack if not for the pale oval of her face. Jonas stood frozen for a moment, remembering another still form, smaller still, that he'd found too late to save. But this wasn't then. He moved forward quickly, kneeling in the snow beside the woman. Young, he noted, though her lips were blue with cold and frost had gathered on her eyelashes. Her threadbare coat offered little protection, and her worn boots were soaked through. "Miss," he touched her shoulder gently. No response. "Miss, can you hear me?" A faint flicker of her eyelids. Still alive? Then, Jonas made a quick decision, scooping her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, bird bones and wet wool. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her to the wagon. He laid her carefully among the timber, pulling off his heavy coat to wrap around her. The temperature was dropping fast. She wouldn't last another hour out here. The question was what to do with her. Taking an unknown woman to his home would set every tongue in Pine Hollow wagging, but the alternative was leaving her to freeze. Martha's voice echoed in his memory. "You can't save everyone, Jonas." But he hadn't saved anyone in 3 years. Maybe it was time to try. The ride to his small ranch seemed endless. He stopped twice to check that she was still breathing, relief flooding through him each time he saw the faint mist of her breath in the cold air. Buttercup seemed to understand the urgency, moving faster than usual despite the dark and her heavy load. Jonas's property sat a mile outside town, far enough for privacy but close enough for necessary trips to market. The log house stood dark against the snow, no welcoming light in the windows. He never left lamps burning. An empty house didn't need illumination. He pulled up beside the barn, torn between taking the stranger inside immediately or settling Buttercup first. The mare decided for him, stamping and whinnying her displeasure at being left in harness. All right. He unhitched her quickly, leading her into her stall with practiced movements. The barn was warmer than outside, filled with the comfortable smell of hay and horses. An idea struck him. The tack room at the back had a small stove he used when working on repairs during winter. It was cleaner than the barn proper, with a wooden floor instead of dirt. He quickly laid out fresh straw and the thick horse blankets he kept for emergencies. Returning to the wagon, he lifted the woman again. She stirred slightly, mumbling something he couldn't make out. At least she was warming enough to move. He carried her into the tack room and laid her on the makeshift bed, then set about starting a fire in the stove. The kindling caught quickly, and soon warmth began to fill the small space. Jonas studied his unexpected guest in the growing light, young as he'd thought, with dark hair escaping from a practical bonnet. Her dress was decent but worn, mended multiple times with careful stitches. Her hands, when he gently removed her wet gloves, were work-roughened but clean. Whatever she wasn't a saloon girl or traveling entertainer. "Where did you come from?" he asked the silence. She stirred again, eyelids fluttering, her eyes opened briefly brown, confused, frightened before closing again. "It's all right," Jonas said quietly, though he doubted she could hear him. "You're safe now." He needed to get her out of those wet clothes, but propriety made him hesitate. Martha would have known what to do. Martha would have taken charge, efficient and caring. But Martha wasn't here, and this woman would die of pneumonia if she stayed in wet wool much longer. "Compromise?" He unlaced her boots, peeling away stockings that were more whole than fabric. Her feet were white as porcelain, toes swollen with cold. He rubbed them gently, trying to restore circulation, then wrapped them in dry rags. The coat came next his own, then hers beneath it. He draped both over a chair near the stove to dry. That would have to do. He covered her with 2 more horse blankets, tucking them carefully around her small form. Now Jonas sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of the enormity of what he'd done. Come morning, he'd have to explain her presence. The proper thing would be to fetch the doctor, maybe the minister's wife. But something held him back. The way she'd been huddled in that alley. Hidden from sight, she'd been avoiding notice. And in Pine Hollow, notice usually meant judgment. He'd seen it happen before. Young women who arrived alone, looking for work or family that didn't materialize. The town had a way of chewing them up, spitting them out. Most ended up at paradise or moved on if they were lucky. This one had chosen freezing over those options. That told him something about her character. "You'll freeze out here." The words came out as barely a whisper. Jonas looked down to find her eyes open, focused on his face with surprising clarity. "Not anymore," he said. "Found you behind Henderson's, near frozen solid." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. I need to... "You need to rest. Get warm." He kept his voice gentle but firm. "Everything else can wait until morning." "Don't have anywhere." Her eyes started to close again. "Then I'll freeze quietly." The words were so soft he almost missed them, but something in the resigned tone, the acceptance of death over dishonor, hit him like a physical blow. "You'll do no such thing," he said roughly. "You'll stay right here until you're warm and fed, then we'll figure out the rest." She studied him for a long moment, searching for something in his face. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and closed her eyes again. Jonas added more wood to the stove, then settled himself on an overturned crate near the door. He couldn't leave her alone. She might take a turn for the worse, or wake confused and frightened. But he also needed to maintain some distance, for both their sakes. The hours passed slowly. He dozed occasionally, jerking awake to check on her breathing. Once she cried out in her sleep, something about her mother, and he almost went to comfort her before catching himself. Another time she mumbled about a letter, a job that had vanished. The pieces of her story emerged in fragments. Near dawn, she woke properly. Jonas had just added fresh wood to the stove when he heard her shift on the straw bed. "Where am I?" No panic in her voice, just careful assessment. Jonas Merrick's ranch, about a mile outside Pine Hollow, in the barn, specifically the tack room. He stayed by the stove, giving her space. Seemed warmer than the house. She pushed herself to sitting, holding the blankets carefully around herself. In the lamplight, he could see the purple shadows under her eyes, the gaunt hollows of someone who'd been hungry too long. "I remember you. You asked if I'd freeze out here. And you said you'd do it quietly." He pulled the coffee pot from the stove. "Coffee, it's terrible, but it's hot." "Please." She accepted the tin cup gratefully, wrapping both hands around it. "I'm Clara May Rutledge." "Jonas." He poured his own cup, then retreated to his crate. "You came on yesterday's train?" She nodded. "From Kansas City. I had a position arranged, room and board at the Traveler's Rest." A bitter smile crossed her face. "The owner sold out. The new man didn't want me." "Henley." Jonas spat the name like a curse. "Man would charge his own mother rent for standing in his doorway." "I tried everywhere else, every shop, every home that might need help, but a woman alone." She shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. "Pine Hollow's not known for its charity." Jonas agreed. He studied her over his coffee cup. "No family to wire, no friends. My mother passed 2 months ago. Consumption. She was all I had." She said it simply, without self-pity. "I thought this job was my chance to start over." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Jonas found himself oddly at ease with this stranger, maybe because she didn't flutter or simper, didn't try to charm or manipulate. Just sat there drinking bad coffee like it was normal to wake up in a barn with a man she'd never met. "I should go," Clara said eventually. "I've imposed enough. If you could just point me toward—" "Toward what?" His voice came out harsher than intended. "That alley where I found you, another night in the cold. You wouldn't last, and we both know it." She lifted her chin, pride flaring in her eyes. "I don't take charity." "Good. I'm not offering it." Jonas made a decision that would have shocked him an hour ago. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Clean 10 chickens, basic ranch work." "I can learn what I don't know." He nodded. "Then you can stay. Work for room and board until you save enough to move on. Or until spring, when travel's easier." He held up a hand as she started to protest. "The barn's warm and dry, better than most places in town, and I could use the help." It was true. He realized. The house had gone to seed since Martha died. He lived on coffee and cold biscuit, wore the same clothes until they fell apart. Having someone else around might force him back toward civilized habits. Clara studied him for a long moment. "Why?" Why indeed? Because he was tired of death winning. Because she'd chosen to freeze with dignity rather than sacrifice it for warmth. Because something in her reminded him of Martha's quiet strength. "Because it's practical," he said instead, "and because everyone deserves a second chance." She nodded slowly. "All right, but I work no charity." "No charity," he agreed. Outside, the sky was lightening toward dawn. Soon the town would wake, and word would spread that Jonas Merrick had a woman on his property. The gossip would be vicious. But looking at Clara May Rutledge, sitting straight-backed despite everything she'd endured, Jonas found he didn't much care what Pine Hollow thought. For the first time in 3 years, he'd done something besides just survive another day. Maybe that was reason enough. Clara woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the pale light of dawn filtering through cracks in the barn wall. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was the sweet smell of hay, the warmth of thick blankets, the absence of bitter cold. Then memory rushed back the alley, the stranger who'd found her, the unlikely offer of shelter. She sat up carefully, pleased to find her feet responded normally when she flexed them. Her boots sat by the stove, dry now, stuffed with straw to help them keep their shape. Her coat hung on a peg, and someone Jonas, it must have been, had left a pile of fresh clothing on the crate. The clothes were clearly a woman's, though years out of fashion. A simple brown work dress, patched but clean. A thick shawl, wool stockings without holes. Clara held them for a moment, understanding the significance. These had belonged to his wife. She dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with unfamiliar buttons. The dress was too long, made for a taller woman, but it was warm and decent. She pinned her hair as best she could without a mirror, then ventured out of the tack room. The barn was empty except for 2 horses in their stalls, the mare from last night and a younger gelding. Both raised their heads to study her with liquid brown eyes. Through the open barn door, she could see Jonas by a woodpile, axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. Clara took a breath and stepped into the morning light. The cold hit her immediately, but it was nothing compared to yesterday's bone-deep freeze. She made her way across the yard, noting the small chicken coop, the well, the house that stood silent and somewhat neglected. Jonas paused mid-swing when he saw her. "Morning. Feeling better?" "Much. Thank you for the clothes." He nodded shortly and went back to splitting wood. Clara watched for a moment, then said, "Where should I start?" He gestured toward the house with his axe. "Haven't been inside yet. Coffee's probably ready. Biscuits in the tin, though they're yesterday's." A pause. "Or older." Clara took the hint. The house was as she expected a man living alone, grieving, letting things slide. Not filthy, just neglected. Dust on every surface. Dishes piled in the dry sink. Floors that hadn't seen a mop in months. But the bones were good, a solid table. Well-made chairs, a cook stove that just needed cleaning. She found the coffee pot on the back of the stove. Still warm. The biscuits were indeed old, hard as rocks. The pantry revealed the extent of Jonas's bachelor existence: coffee, flour, salt pork, beans, a few preserves growing mold. Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time Jonas came in 2 hours later, she'd heated water, washed the dishes, and had a pot of beans soaking for later. The table was cleared. The floor swept. She'd found eggs in the chicken coop and was scrambling them in a clean pan. He stopped in the doorway, something flickering across his face too quickly to read. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said, suddenly uncertain. "I thought—" "It's fine." His voice was rough. "It's good." They ate in silence. Jonas clearly unaccustomed to company. Clara noticed how his eyes kept drifting to the corner where a child's chair sat, to the window where cheerful curtains hung faded and still. "Your wife," she said carefully. "How long—" 3 years. He set down his fork. The fever took them all. Martha, our boy Samuel, our little girl Rebecca, all in the same week. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. "God's will," the minister said. Never could figure out what kind of God wills that. Clara knew better than to offer platitudes. She'd heard them all when her mother died, each one more hollow than the last. After breakfast, Jonas showed her around the property. The chicken coop needed cleaning, but the hens seemed healthy. The root cellar was well stocked, apparently. Neighbors had continued bringing food even if Jonas rarely ate it. There was a small garden plot, dormant under snow, and a shed full of tools. I leave early most days, he explained. Timber doesn't cut itself. There's plenty here to keep busy, if you're inclined. I'm inclined, Clara assured him. He studied her for a moment. Why didn't you go to paradise? Would have been warmer than that alley. She met his gaze steadily. Same reason you didn't remarry the first widow who came calling? Some things are worth more than comfort. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Fair enough. He left for the timber fields, and Clara returned to the house. She worked methodically, room by room. In the main bedroom, she found a daguerreotype of a woman and 2 children. Martha had been pretty, with laugh lines around her eyes. The children looked like their father, serious and sturdy. Clara set the picture carefully on the dresser where it could be seen from the bed. She didn't touch the other personal items, the hairbrush still holding golden strands, the small shoes lined up by the wardrobe. Those weren't hers to move. By evening, the house looked habitable again. She'd found salt pork and made a simple stew, baked fresh biscuits. When Jonas returned, he stood in his own doorway like a stranger. Different, was all he said. They ate quietly. Clara had taken Martha's chair without thinking, and she saw him notice, saw him decide not to comment. After supper, she started to clear the plates. You don't have to, he began. Yes, I do. She kept her tone light but firm. You're giving me shelter. I'm giving you a clean house and hot meals. Fair trade. That night, she returned to the barn. Jonas had improved her corner, added more straw, hung a blanket across the opening for privacy, left a lantern and matches. It was more consideration than she'd gotten from anyone in Pine Hollow proper. The days fell into a pattern. Clara woke early, gathered eggs, made breakfast. Jonas ate and left for the timber fields. She cleaned, cooked, mended clothes he hadn't realized needed mending. In the afternoon, she might tackle the garden shed or organize the root cellar. Evenings, they ate together, conversation gradually becoming easier. She learned that Jonas had come west from Ohio, seeking space and opportunity, that he'd met Martha at a barn raising, courted her for 2 years before her father agreed to the match, that he'd built this house with his own hands, adding rooms as children came. In turn, she told him about growing up in Kansas City, her mother taking in sewing to keep them fed, about her uncle's drinking, his heavy hands when the liquor ran out, about the night she'd finally had enough, the careful planning to escape. Why you left? Jonas asked one evening. Part of it. Mama's death was the final push. Nothing left to stay for. He nodded, understanding without judgment. On her 4th morning at the ranch, Clara looked up from kneading bread to find a woman at the door. Middle-aged, sharp-eyed, wearing her respectability like armor. I'm Mrs. Prudence Willoughby, the woman announced, from the Ladies' Aid Society. Clara's hand stilled on the dough. How can I help you? I think the question is what you're doing here, young woman. Mrs. Willoughby's gaze swept the clean kitchen, lingering on the evidence of domesticity. The whole town's talking. About what? About Jonas Merrick taking in a woman of uncertain background. The pause before woman spoke volumes. Clara resumed kneading, putting more force than necessary into it. Mr. Merrick was kind enough to offer me work. I keep house in exchange for room and board. Room where exactly? The barn, the tack room. Specifically, quite proper, I assure you. Mrs. Willoughby sniffed. Nothing about this situation is proper. An unmarried woman, living on a widower's property, no chaperone. Would it be more proper if I'd frozen to death in an alley? Clara's voice stayed calm, but her knuckles were white on the dough. Because that was the alternative. Ma'am, your town made that very clear. The woman's face flushed. That's hardly... What's going on here? Jonas filled the doorway, earlier than usual. His expression was mild, but Clara saw the steel underneath. "Jonas!" "Mrs." Willoughby shifted tactics, voice becoming coaxing. "Surely you see how this looks. For your own reputation." "My reputation." He stepped inside, hanging his hat with a deliberate calm. "My reputation is that of a man who minds his own business and expects others to do the same. But people are talking. Let them." His tone ended the conversation. "Miss Rutledge, that bread smells near ready. Mrs. Willoughby, I believe you know the way out." The woman left in a huff of outraged dignity. Jonas sat heavily at the table, and Clara noticed the lines of fatigue around his eyes. "She won't be the last," Clara said quietly. "I know." He rubbed his face. "You don't have to stay. I could stake you to a ticket somewhere else." "Is that what you want?" He looked up sharply. "No, but I won't have you harassed on my account." Clara shaped the dough into loaves with practiced movements. "I've been harassed by worse than church ladies. Mr. Merrick takes more than disapproving looks to run me off." That ghost smile appeared again. "Stubborn." "Practical," she corrected. "I have work, shelter, and an employer who treats me decent. Why would I leave?" But she knew it wouldn't be that simple. "Mrs. Willoughby's visit was just the beginning. Pine Hollow had decided what kind of woman lived in a man's barn, and they wouldn't easily change their minds. That night, Jonas left a thick wool blanket outside the tack room. No words, just the blanket and a pair of sturdy work gloves. Clara held them for a long moment, throat tight. Such small kindnesses, offered without expectation or demand. She'd found shelter from more than the cold at Jonas Merrick's ranch. Whether it would be enough to weather the storm of gossip brewing in town remained to be seen. But for now, she had warm clothes, a dry place to sleep, and work that mattered. It was more than she'd had in months, maybe years. Clara folded the blanket carefully, set the gloves aside for morning, and prepared for another night in the barn. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more disapproving visitors, more reminders that she didn't belong. But tonight she was safe, fed, warm. For now, that was enough. The rhythm of their days had settled into something comfortable by the second week. Clara had the coffee ready when Jonas came in from morning chores, and he'd taken to bringing in extra wood without being asked. They moved around each other with the careful courtesy of two people learning to share space. "You're not afraid of hard work, are you?" Jonas observed one morning, watching her haul water from the well. Clara set the bucket down, rubbing her lower back. "Never have been. Mama used to say idle hands were the devil's playground." Mine said the same. He took the bucket from her, carrying it inside. "Though I suspect the devil finds plenty of playgrounds among the industrious, too." It was the closest he'd come to humor since she'd arrived. Clara treasured these small moments of lightness, rare glimpses of who Jonas Merrick might have been before grief carved those lines around his eyes. That afternoon, she found him in the barn, mending harness leather. The late winter sun slanted through the doorway, catching dust motes in its beam. Mr. Merrick," she began. "Jonas," he corrected without looking up. "Seems foolish to stand on ceremony when you're washing my clothes." "Jonas, then—" She liked the sound of it, simple and solid. "I was thinking about the garden plot. Come spring, I could get vegetables started, maybe some herbs." His hands paused on the leather. "Martha always had herbs. Used to dry them in bunches from the kitchen rafters." "Would you mind if I did the same?" He resumed working, but she caught the slight softening around his mouth. "Don't see why I would." Clara took that as approval and began planning. She'd found Martha's seed collection in the root cellar, carefully labeled in a neat hand. It felt strange, using another woman's things, following paths worn by other feet. But the alternative was letting it all go to waste, and that seemed the greater disrespect. The next morning brought unexpected company. Clara was feeding the chickens when a wagon pulled up, driven by a man she recognized from town Thomas Garrett, the blacksmith. "Morning, miss," he called, tipping his hat. "Jonas around?" "In the east field," she replied, trying not to show her surprise at the friendly greeting. "I'll wait, if that's all right. Got some business to discuss." Clara offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. As they sat at the kitchen table, she noticed him taking in the clean floors, the bread rising on the stove. "Place looks good," he said finally. "Haven't seen it this neat since—" He trailed off, clearly not wanting to mention Martha. "I try to earn my keep." He studied her over his cup. "Folks in town are talking." "So I've heard." "Not all of it's bad." He set the cup down carefully. "My wife, Sarah. She says any woman who chooses freezing over compromising her principles deserves better than Pine Hollow gave you." Clara blinked, surprised. "That's kind of her." "She also says if you need anything women's things, advice, just another woman to talk to, you're welcome at our place." It was the first offer of friendship she'd received since stepping off the train. Clara had to swallow past the sudden tightness in her throat. "Thank her for me. That means a great deal." Jonas returned then, ending the conversation. But as Thomas drove away, having arranged for Jonas to supply lumber for a new barn, Clara felt something ease in her chest. Not everyone in Pine Hollow had judged her. Perhaps there was hope yet. That evening, Jonas surprised her. Usually, after supper, he retreated to the barn or sat by the fire whittling. Tonight, he cleared his throat and said, "You mentioned knowing how to make soup. You called it—" "Yes, my mother learned from a Vietnamese woman in Kansas City. Mrs. Nguyen lived next door, taught Mama in exchange for help with English. Would you make it sometime? I'd like to try it." It was such a small request, but Clara understood the significance. He was asking her to bring something of herself into this house, not just maintain what Martha had built. "I'll need ginger," she said, "and some other things from town." He reached into his pocket, pulling out coins. "Get what you need." The next morning, Clara steeled herself for a trip to Pine Hollow. She wore Martha's second-best dress, pinned her hair severely, and practiced her most neutral expression. The 2-mile walk gave her time to prepare for whatever reception awaited. To her surprise, it was mixed. Mrs. Willoughby and her circle pointedly crossed the street to avoid her, but the baker, Mr. Hoffman, nodded politely when she entered his shop, and Sarah Garrett, the blacksmith's wife, actually smiled and asked after her health. "Heard you make a fine stew," Sarah said, her tone warm. "Tom came home singing your praises." Clara purchased what she needed quickly, aware of the eyes following her movements. At the general store, she overheard 2 women whispering. "Living in his barn like an animal," one said. "Better than what some would do for a roof," the other replied. "And Tom Garrett says the house is spotless. She's working, not lounging about." Small victories, Clara thought as she walked home. Small shifts in opinion. Maybe in time, Pine Hollow would accept her as more than a scandal. That night, she made the soup a simple version with what she could find, but fragrant with ginger and herbs. Jonas ate slowly, thoughtfully. "Different," he said finally, "but good, warming." "Mrs. Nguyen said it could cure anything from cold to heartbreak." Clara paused. "Though I never found it worked on the latter." Jonas looked up sharply, perhaps hearing an echo of his own grief in her words. "No," he agreed quietly. "Some things can't be cured, only endured." They finished the meal in companionable silence. As the days passed, Clara noticed small changes in Jonas. He began talking more at meals, sharing stories of his timber work or observations about the weather. Once, she caught him almost smiling at something the rooster did. For her part, Clara found herself settling in ways she hadn't expected. The work was hard but satisfying. the solitude, broken only by Jonas's quiet presence, soothed something in her that had been raw since her mother's death, maybe before. One evening, Jonas found her mending one of his shirts by lamplight, squinting at the fine stitches. "You don't have to work so late," he said. "I like to keep my hands busy." She tied off the thread. "Besides, this needed doing. You can't go to town with your elbow poking through." He sat across from her, picking up his whittling. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of knife on wood and the pop of the fire. "Why didn't you remarry?" Clara asked suddenly, then flushed. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." Jonas didn't seem offended. "Everyone expected me to. Parade of widows and hopeful fathers started about 6 months after, but I couldn't pretend to feel something I didn't. Couldn't replace them like they were worn-out boots." "That's not what it would be," Clara said softly. "Not replacing, just making room for something new alongside the old." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "Speaking from experience." "No, but I watched my mother mourn my father my whole life. She never remarried either. Sometimes I wondered if she might have been happier if she had." Clara folded the mended shirt carefully. "Love doesn't have to be either or. I think hearts are bigger than that." Jonas went back to his whittling, but she could see him turning the words over in his mind. The next day brought the worst storm of the season. Jonas barely made it back from the timber fields before the world went white. Clara had moved the chickens into the barn and secured everything she could, but the wind still found ways to creep in. "This could last days," Jonas said, shaking snow from his coat. "Hope you don't mind being stuck here." "Better than being stuck in that alley," Clara replied, ladling hot soup into bowls. They spent the storm's duration in closer quarters than usual. Jonas taught her to play checkers with a set he'd carved. She told him stories her mother had passed down, folk tales from various neighbors over the years. When the wind howled especially fierce, they worked together to check on the animals, Jonas holding the rope line while Clara carried the lantern. On the third night, the storm finally exhausting itself, they sat by the fire, exhausted from maintaining warmth and keeping animals fed. "Thank you," Jonas said suddenly. Clara looked up from the sock she was darning. "For what?" "For making this place feel alive again." He stared into the flames. "I had forgotten what that was like." "You gave me shelter when no one else would," Clara replied. "Seems to me the thanks go the other way." He shook his head. "Shelter's just walls and a roof. You brought something more." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to examine too closely. Clara bent back to her darning, aware of a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When the storm cleared, revealing a world buried in white, Clara stood on the porch, breathing the sharp, clean air. Jonas joined her, and they surveyed the damage together minimal, thanks to their preparations. "Spring will come," he said, apropos of nothing. "Always does," Clara agreed. "You still planning to move on when it does?" She considered the question. Her original plan had been to save money, find somewhere to start fresh. But standing here, looking out over land she'd helped tend, beside a man who'd shown her kindness without expectation. "I don't know," she answered honestly. Maybe not." Jonas nodded, and she thought she caught relief in the gesture. "Well, no need to decide now. Winter's not done with us yet." They went inside together, back to the warmth and work of the day. But something had shifted between them, subtle as snow beginning to melt. Not yet spring, but the promise of it. That night, Clara lay in her barn room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of horses and hay. She thought about roots, about belonging, about the difference between running towards something and running away. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt the possibility of home. The first signs of spring came slowly to pine hollow patches of brown earth showing through melting snow. The sound of running water as creeks broke free of ice. With the thaw came visitors, and Clara quickly learned that Jonas Merrick's property was no longer the isolated refuge it had been during the winter months. It started on a Sunday afternoon. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching. 3 women from town rode up in a wagon, their faces set with determination. She recognized Mrs. Willoughby, of course, flanked by Mrs. Downing and a younger woman she didn't know. "Miss Rutledge," Mrs. Willoughby called without dismounting. "We've come to speak with you about your situation." Clara continued pinning sheets to the line. "My situation is unchanged, Mrs. Willoughby. I work for Mr. Merrick in exchange for room and board. For 3 months now," Mrs. Downing added, her tone suggesting this duration made everything worse. "People are beginning to assume permanence." The younger woman, introduced as Mrs. Abernathy, leaned forward. "My husband says Mr. Merrick has been seen smiling in town. Smiling, the man hasn't smiled since his family passed." "Perhaps he's healing," Clara suggested mildly. "Or perhaps," Mrs. Willoughby's voice dropped meaningfully, "he's being led astray by improper influence." Clara's hands stilled on the clothespin. She turned to face them fully. "If you have accusations to make, Mrs. Willoughby, please make them plainly." "Very well. It's unseemly for an unmarried woman to live on a widower's property. If you had any decency." "Decency?" Clara's voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed. "Where was decency when I was freezing in an alley? Where was Christian charity when I knocked on doors asking only for honest work? That's hardly—" "You turned me away, all of you, called me names, suggested I was something I'm not, left me to die in the cold." Clara took a step closer to the wagon. "Mr. Merrick showed me the kindness this town couldn't muster. If that makes him improper in your eyes, perhaps you should examine your own hearts." Jonas appeared from the barn, drawn by the voices. He took in the scene with a glance, then positioned himself beside Clara, not touching, but close enough to show where he stood. "Ladies," he said quietly, "Sunday's a day of rest. I'd appreciate if you'd respect that." "Mrs. Willoughby's face flushed. "Jonas Merrick, we're only thinking of your reputation." "My reputation survived 3 years of being a hermit. I think it can survive employing a housekeeper." His tone was mild, but there was steel beneath. "Now, if you'll excuse us, there's work to be done." The women left in a flutter of offended dignity, but Clara knew they'd be back, or others like them would come. The town had decided their arrangement was scandalous, and scandals in small towns had a way of growing teeth. "I'm sorry," she said as the wagon disappeared down the road. For what speaking truth? Jonas picked up the empty laundry basket. About time someone did. But the visits continued. The minister himself came next, full of biblical quotations about avoiding the appearance of evil. Jonas listened politely, then asked which scripture commanded leaving young women to freeze in alleys. The minister left without an answer. Some visitors were kinder. Sarah Garrett came by with preserves and stayed for tea, chatting with Clara about gardening and recipes. Tom Garrett often stopped to discuss lumber orders with Jonas, always treating Clara with respect. A few other townspeople began nodding to her on the street, though many still crossed to avoid her. One afternoon, Clara was in the garden plot, turning soil for spring planting, when she heard a commotion from the road. A group of young men from town had ridden out, whiskey-bowled and looking for entertainment. "Hey there, pretty thing," one called. "Heard you're keeping Merrick's bed warm these days." Clara straightened but didn't respond, hoping they'd move on. Instead, they dismounted, approaching the garden fence. "Must be nice," another said, "finding a man desperate enough to take in damaged goods." "Get off my land!" Jonas's voice came from behind her, cold as winter wind. He stood in the barn doorway, rifle in hand, not pointed but clearly visible. Now, Merrick, we're just being friendly. No, you're being disrespectful to a lady on my property. Jonas stepped forward. And I've got no patience for it. Move along, or I'll help you along. The young men exchanged glances, weighing their options. The whiskey made them bold, but not stupid. They mounted up, tossing a few more crude comments as they rode away. Clara found she was shaking, not from fear but from anger. "Thank you," she managed. Jonas set the rifle aside and surprised her by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" "Yes, just tired of it. The assumptions, the judgment." "I know." His hand dropped away, but the warmth lingered. "Maybe I should—" "If you're about to suggest sending me away for my own good, save your breath." Clara turned to face him. "I'm not a child to be protected. Jonas, I'm a grown woman who's faced worse than small-town gossip." He studied her for a long moment. Haven't you faced worse?" It wasn't really a question, but Clara nodded anyway. They danced around the edges of her past, but never delved deep. Now didn't seem the time either. "Then we'll face this together." Jonas said simply, "If you're willing." Together. The word sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I'm willing." That evening, Jonas surprised her again, after supper. Instead of retreating to his usual evening routines, he cleared his throat. Would you like to sit on the porch a spell evenings warm enough?" It was the first time he'd invited her to simply sit with him. No work involved. Clara nodded, fetching her shawl. They settled on the bench Jonas had built, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and pink. The silence between them was comfortable now, born of months of shared meals and mutual respect. "My wife loved this time of day," Jonas said eventually. "Called it God's art show." "She sounds like she was special." "She was—" A pause. "You would have liked her. She had your way of seeing past surface things to what mattered." Clara felt the compliment warm her more than the evening sun. "Tell me about her, if you want." So he did. Stories flowing like water from a dam finally opened. Martha's laugh, the way she sang to the chickens, her talent for making feast from famine. The children, too, Samuel's determination to do everything his father did. Rebecca's collection of pretty rocks. Clara listened, offering the gift of witness to his memories. When his voice finally faded with the light, she said softly, "Thank you for sharing them with me. Thank you for listening." He turned to look at her in the gathering dusk. "Most people want me to forget. Move on. You let me remember." "Remembering's not the enemy of moving forward," Clara said. "Sometimes it's what makes moving forward possible." They sat quietly as stars began to appear. Finally, Jonas stood, offering his hand to help her up. "It's getting late." But he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and Clara felt something shift between them. Not dramatic, just a gentle tilting toward possibilities neither was quite ready to name. The next morning brought a surprise. Clara was gathering eggs when she spotted a familiar figure walking up the road, Mrs. Nguyen's daughter, Lily, from Kansas City. Clara Lily embraced her warmly. "When your last letter said you'd found work in Montana, I had to see for myself." Clara was overjoyed to see a friendly face from home. She introduced Lily to Jonas, who greeted her politely before excusing himself to the timber fields. "So," Lily said once they were alone, her eyes twinkling, "your letter mentioned an employer, failed to mention he was handsome." "Lily," Clara blushed, "it's not like that. He's been kind, nothing more." Lily's knowing look said she wasn't fooled. "And you're living in his barn because—" Clara explained the situation, the town's reaction, Jonas's protection. Lily's expression grew serious. "And you're happy here truly?" Clara considered the question. Was she happy? She thought of quiet evenings by the fire, Jonas's rare smiles, the satisfaction of honest work, the garden waiting to bloom. "Yes," she said, somewhat surprised by the certainty. "I am." Lily stayed for 3 days, helping with chores and sharing news from Kansas City. Her presence seemed to ease something in the town's perception, too. Clara had a friend, a connection to her past that made her more real, less the mysterious woman who'd appeared from nowhere. The night before Lily left, she pulled Clara aside. "That man cares for you. You know that, right?" "He cares for having a clean house and hot meals." Clara deflected. "Clara May Rutledge. I've known you since we were girls. Don't play dense." Lily squeezed her hands. "The question is, what do you feel?" Clara couldn't answer. Didn't know how to name the warmth that spread through her when Jonas smiled, the way she looked forward to their evening conversations, the gentle partnership they'd built through winter into spring. "Just be careful," Lily said finally. "But not too careful. Life's short. Clara, your mother would want you to be happy." After Lily left, the house felt quieter. Jonas seemed to sense Clara's melancholy, making efforts to draw her out. He asked about her friend, about Kansas City, about her plans for the garden. "I thought maybe herbs along the south wall," Clara said, grateful for the distraction. "Basil, thyme, the seeds I found." "Martha's seeds," he said gently. "It's all right to say her name. And yes, the south wall would be perfect." They worked side by side that afternoon, preparing the garden beds, and if their hands brushed occasionally, if they stood closer than strictly necessary, neither acknowledged it. But the awareness hummed between them like bees in the warming air. That night, Clara lay awake thinking about Lily's words, about happiness and choices and the way Jonas had said, "Together." Spring was here. The roads were clear. She could leave if she wanted, start fresh somewhere else. But looking around the small room that had become home, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night, Clara knew she wouldn't. Somewhere between that frozen alley and this warm spring evening, she'd put down roots. Now she just had to decide what to do about the way her heart raced when Jonas Merrick smiled. The late spring storm rolled in without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as coal. Clara had just finished planting the herb garden when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, it became a deluge. She ran for the house, but Jonas wasn't back from the timber fields yet. As the hours passed and the storm intensified, worry gnawed at her. The creek that ran through the property was already swollen with snowmelt. This rain could turn it dangerous. By evening, she couldn't stand waiting. She lit a lantern and ventured onto the porch, peering through the sheets of rain. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, terrible flashes. Then she saw him, a figure struggling up the road, bent against the wind. Clara didn't think, just grabbed her shawl and plunged into the storm. "Jonas!" The wind tore her voice away. He was soaked through, shivering violently. A gash on his forehead bled freely, mixing with the rain. "Tree came down," he managed through chattering teeth. "Horse spooked, had to walk." Clara got her shoulder under his arm, helping him the last yards to the house. Inside, she immediately began stripping his wet coat. "Need to get you warm," she said, professional as her mother had been when tending sick neighbors. "Can you manage the rest while I heat water?" He nodded, disappearing into his room. Clara built up the fire and set water to boil, gathering clean cloths and the medicinal supplies she'd organized weeks ago. When Jonas emerged in dry clothes, she guided him to the chair nearest the fire. "Let me see that cut." He submitted to her ministrations without protest, which worried her more than the wound itself. Jonas Merrick didn't accept help easily. The gash was deep but clean. Clara worked carefully, cleaning and binding it while he sat unnaturally still. His skin felt hot under her fingers, too hot. "I think you have a fever starting," she said. "I'm fine." But even as he said it, a violent shiver ran through him. Clara made tea with willow bark and ginger, the same remedy her mother had used. Jonas drank without complaint. Another bad sign. "You should rest," she said. "Storm's not done. Need to check the animals." "I'll do it." She was already reaching for her still damp shawl. His hand caught hers. "Clara, no, it's dangerous." "And you're ill." She squeezed his fingers gently before pulling away. "I've managed storms before. Jonas, trust me." The barn was chaos animals restless, wind howling through gaps in the walls. Clara worked methodically, soothing the horses, securing loose boards, ensuring everyone had food and water. By the time she returned to the house, she was soaked to the skin and exhausted. Jonas had moved to his bed but was clearly fevering in earnest now, tossing restlessly. Clara changed into dry clothes, one of Martha's nightgowns she'd never dared wear before, and prepared for a long night. She made more willow bark tea, coaxing him to drink between fever dreams. She bathed his face with cool cloths, changed the bandage when blood seeped through. Sometime near midnight, he began talking rambling words about Martha, the children, the fire he couldn't put out. "Shh," Clara soothed, stroking his burning forehead. "They're safe now. They're at peace." His hand caught hers again, holding tight. "Don't leave." "I won't," she promised. The fever broke near dawn. Jonas opened clear eyes to find Clara dozing in the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. She stirred when he shifted. "How do you feel?" "Like I got trampled by a horse." His voice was rough but lucid. "You stayed all night. Someone had to keep you from wandering into the storm in your delirium." She tried for light, but exhaustion made her voice shake. "You were quite determined to save everyone." Something shifted in his expression. "Clara, I'll make breakfast." She stood quickly, suddenly aware of their clasped hands, of wearing Martha's nightgown, of the intimacy of the sick room. "You should rest more." But he caught her wrist gently before she could flee. "Thank you." 2 words, simply said, but the look in his eyes made her heart race. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and escaped to the kitchen. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Clara went through the morning routines automatically, checking storm damage, feeding animals, making simple food for an invalid. But her mind kept circling back to that moment, his hand in hers, the weight of unspoken words. Jonas slept most of the day. When evening came, she brought him soup and bread, pleased to see color returning to his face. "I'm not good at this," he said suddenly. Clara paused in setting down the tray. "At what?" "At—" He gestured vaguely between them. "Martha always said I was better with wood than words. Never learned how to say what I mean." She sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "Then don't say it. Show me." He studied her for a long moment, then reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, rough and warm and gentle. "I don't need saving. Jonas," she whispered. "Good," he replied softly. "I'm no savior, but Clara, I need you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Not just for the cooking and cleaning," he continued, struggling but determined. "I need your laugh in the morning, your stories at supper, the way you make this place feel like home again." "Jonas, I know it's not proper. I know the town already talks, but I'm tired of caring what they think." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Stay. Not in the barn. Here. With me." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "You're fevered still. Not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking clearer than I have in 3 years." He dropped his hand but held her gaze. "I'm not asking for... I won't assume. Just stay." She thought of all the reasons to say no. The gossip would be vicious. Her reputation, already tattered, would be destroyed entirely. Proper ladies didn't live with men they weren't married to. But then, proper ladies hadn't survived what she'd survived. Proper ladies hadn't been turned away to freeze, and proper ladies didn't sit all night beside a fevered man's bed, holding his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay." Relief washed over his face. He squeezed her hand, then seemed to remember himself. "We'll do it right. Separate rooms. I'll court you proper, if you'll let me." "Despite everything," Clara laughed. "Court me, Jonas Merrick. I've been washing your clothes for 4 months. Bit late for conventional courtship." Never too late to do things right, but he was almost smiling. What would your mother say? Mama would say. Clara considered. She'd say that kindness matters more than convention, that good men are rare, and that happiness is worth fighting for, even if the whole town disapproves. Wise woman. She was. They sat quietly for a moment, hands linked, adjusting to this new understanding between them. Then Clara's practical nature asserted itself. "You need to eat before the soup gets cold, and I need to move my things from the barn." "Tomorrow," Jonas said. "Tonight, just sit with me." So she did, feeding him soup and telling stories about her day. When he drifted off to sleep, she stayed, watching the peace on his face. Her mother had been right, hearts were bigger than either or. There was room for Martha and the children, for grief and memory. But there was room for new things too, for hope, for possibility, for love that came not as lightning but as sunrise, slow and sure and warm. The next morning, Jonas was well enough to help move her few possessions from the barn to Rebecca's old room. It felt strange, crossing that threshold openly, but also right. "This is your home now," Jonas said firmly. "No more barn." The town will talk regardless. Might as well be comfortable while they do it." He paused in the doorway. "Clara, I meant what I said about courting proper. You deserve that." She set down her satchel and crossed to him. "And what does proper courting look like to you? Walks on Sunday, bringing you flowers, asking permission for a kiss." He colored slightly at the last. Clara smiled. "Then you'd better ask." "May I? That is, would you allow?" She rose on her toes and kissed him gently, ending his fumbling. It was sweet and careful and tasted of new beginnings. When they parted, Jonas looked dazed. "I'm out of practice at this too." "We'll learn together," Clara promised. That afternoon, as expected, Mrs. Willoughby arrived with reinforcements. Clara met them on the porch, Jonas beside her. "We've heard the most shocking news." "Mrs.?" Willoughby began without preamble. "That you've moved into the house properly. This is beyond the pale." "Mrs. Willoughby." Jonas interrupted calmly. "Miss Rutledge has agreed to let me court her, properly, with intentions of marriage, when she's ready." The women exchanged glances, temporarily deflated. Courtship leading to marriage was harder to object to than their previous arrangement. "Well," Mrs. Downing huffed, "it's highly irregular." "So was leaving her to freeze last winter," Jonas said mildly. "Yet here we are." After they left, sputtering threats about propriety and decency, Clara turned to Jonas. "Intentions of marriage." He met her eyes steadily. "When you're ready, if you'll have me. But Clara, no rush, no pressure. We've got time." Time, what a luxury that seemed after months of day-to-day survival. Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had since stepping off that train. "We do," she agreed. "We have all the time we need." That night, she cooked supper in what was now truly her kitchen. Jonas sat at the table, reading aloud from the almanac about optimal planting times, outside. Evening settled gentle over the ranch, and inside, two wounded hearts began the slow, sweet work of healing together. Clara had come to Pine Hollow looking for work and shelter. She'd found so much more: a home, a purpose, A man who saw her worth when the world tried to deny it. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as Jonas reached over to take her hand, she knew it was the life she wanted. The gossips could talk. Let them. She had better things to do than listen. The minister arrived on a Tuesday morning, his black coat stark against the summer green of the ranch. Clara saw him through the kitchen window and sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since word spread that she'd moved into the house properly. "Reverend Hartwell," she greeted him at the door. "Jonas is in the East Field. It's you I've come to see, Miss Rutledge." His expression was grave, disapproving. "May I come in?" She led him to the parlor, serving coffee she knew he wouldn't drink. The Reverend sat stiffly, clutching his Bible like a shield. "I'll be direct. Miss Rutledge, your living arrangement with Mr. Merrick has become a scandal that affects our entire Christian community." Clara kept her voice level. "Mr. Merrick and I have been perfectly clear about our intentions. He's courting me properly. While you live under his roof, share his meals, tend his home like a wife without the sanctity of marriage." The Reverend's voice rose. "If you truly cared for his well-being, spiritual and social, you would leave." "Leave!" Clara set down her cup carefully. "Tell me, Reverend, where should I go? Which family in your congregation would take me in? Which Christian home would open its doors?" He shifted uncomfortably. "That's not the point." "Isn't it?" She leaned forward. "You speak of Christian community. Yet where was that community when I was freezing? Where was Christian charity when I knocked on the church door?" "We cannot be expected to take in every wanderer." "No, just the ones who meet your standards of deserving." Clara stood, anger finally breaking through her careful control. "Jonas Merrick showed me the love and kindness your congregation preaches but doesn't practice. If that's scandal, then perhaps you need to re-examine your definitions." The Reverend's face flushed. "Young woman, you forget yourself. The Bible is clear about avoiding even the appearance of evil. The Bible is also clear about caring for strangers and not judging lest ye be judged." Clara moved to the door. "I believe you know the way out." He left in high dudgeon, promising consequences for her defiance. Clara watched him go, then sank into a chair, shaking. She'd just alienated the most powerful moral authority in Pine Hollow. When Jonas returned for lunch, he found her still sitting there. "What's wrong?" He knelt beside her chair, work-rough hands gentle on hers. She told him about the Reverend's visit, her own sharp words. "I'm sorry. I've made things worse for you." Jonas's jaw tightened. That man has no right. "He has every right, in the town's eyes." Clara touched his face. "Jonas, maybe he's right. Maybe I should—"
"Don't!" His voice was fierce. "Don't you dare let them drive you away. Not again."
"But your reputation." "My reputation." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. 3 years I've lived like a ghost. 3 years of people crossing the street to avoid the grieving widower? You think I care what they say now? You should care. This is your home, your community." He turned back to her. "You are my home now. You're what matters." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Clara felt tears threaten. "Besides," Jonas continued more quietly, "not everyone agrees with Hartwell. Tom and Sarah support us, the Millers, the Johansons, good people who judge by actions, not appearances." That evening, as if to prove his point, Sarah Garrett arrived with a basket of preserves and fresh bread. She embraced Clara warmly, then fixed Jonas with a stern look. "About time you two made things official. Though you might consider speeding up this courtship before Hartwell works the whole town into a frenzy." "Sarah," her husband warned from the doorway, "not our business." "Everything's everyone's business in Pine Hollow." Sarah retorted, "Might as well have friends involved as enemies." She turned back to Clara. "The Reverend's already calling special meetings about moral decay in our community. You need allies." Over the next days, the town divided sharply. Some, like the Garretts, openly supported Jonas and Clara. Others, led by the Reverend and Mrs. Willoughby, spoke of boycotting Jonas's lumber, of Christian duty to shun sin. Clara felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She'd brought this conflict to Jonas's door. Maybe leaving would be the kindest thing. "Stop it," Jonas said one evening, reading her thoughts in her expression. "I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no." They were sitting on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Clara had been quiet all through supper, the Reverend's words echoing in her mind. "I'm not worth all this trouble," she said quietly. Jonas set down his coffee cup with a sharp click. "Clara May Rutledge, I'm only going to say this once, so listen well." He turned to face her fully. "You are worth 10 of Reverend Hartwell, 20 of Mrs. Willoughby. You're worth any amount of trouble, scandal, or gossip." "Jonas." "No, my turn to talk." He took her hands. "You asked once why I helped you. Want to know the truth? That night I found you. I'd been thinking about Martha and the children, thinking maybe it was time to join them." Clara's breath caught. Then there you were, half frozen but still fighting, still choosing life even when it had given you nothing but hardship. His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "You saved me that night as much as I saved you. Gave me a reason to keep going, so don't you dare tell me you're not worth it." Clara was crying now, unable to stop the tears. Jonas pulled her against his chest, holding her while she wept for all of it, the kindness, the cruelty, the unexpected gift of love in the midst of judgment. "I'm not good enough for you," she whispered against his shirt. "Good thing that's not your decision to make." She could hear the smile in his voice. "It's mine, and I choose you, Clara, today, tomorrow, and all the days after." The next Sunday, they attended church together for the first time. Clara wore her best dress, Martha's dress, really, altered to fit. Jonas wore his wedding suit, pressed and proper. They walked in with heads high, taking their usual pew despite the whispers that followed. Reverend Hartwell's sermon was pointed, full of references to Jezebels and the wages of sin. Clara kept her eyes forward, but she felt Jonas tense beside her. When the congregation rose for the final hymn, he took her hand openly, publicly, daring anyone to comment. After the service, the community split visibly. Some hurried past without acknowledgement, but others, more than Clara had expected, stopped to greet them. Old Mr. Muller, the German baker, clasped Jonas's shoulder. "Good to see you among the living again, son." Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, smiled at Clara. "You come see me this week. I have fabric you might like for new curtains." Even some unexpected allies emerged. Miss Thornton, the spinster dressmaker who'd once turned Clara away, approached hesitantly. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was wrong to judge without knowing. If you need anything, my shop is open to you." It wasn't a complete victory. The Reverend's faction remained vocal and vindictive, but it was a start. That afternoon, Jonas surprised Clara by leading her to the small cemetery where Martha and the children were buried. She hesitated at the gate, but he drew her forward gently. "Want you to meet them proper," he said simply. 3 headstones stood in a row, well tended with wildflowers growing around them. Jonas knelt, brushing leaves from Martha's stone. "Martha, this is Clara. She's brought life back to our home. Think you'd like her." His voice was steady, peaceful. "She makes that soup I told you about, takes care of your garden, makes me laugh again." Clara knelt beside him, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "I'll take care of him," she whispered to the stone. "I promise." They stayed a while longer, Jonas telling stories about each of them. When they finally rose to leave, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not replacement, but continuation. The past honored, the future possible. Walking home, Jonas said quietly. Reverend Hartwell came to see me yesterday, privately. Said if we married quick and quiet, he'd perform the ceremony and calm the waters. Clara stopped walking. What did you tell him? Told him we'd marry when we were ready, not when he decreed it. Jonas faced her. But Clara, I am ready. Have been for weeks. Just didn't want to rush you. She studied his face, the steadiness in his eyes, the patient love, the strength that had sheltered her from the first night. I don't need more time, she said softly. I need you. His smile was like sunrise. Then marry me. Not for them. Not to quiet gossip. For us. Yes, Clara said simply. Yes. He kissed her there on the road, in full view of anyone watching. Let them talk, let them gossip. She'd found something worth more than their approval, a love built on kindness, respect, and the choice to keep choosing each other despite everything. When they reached home, Jonas paused at the door. Welcome home, future Mrs. Merrick. Clara smiled, stepping over the threshold of what was truly, finally, completely her home. I've been home since the night you found me in that alley. No, Jonas corrected gently. That's the night we found each other. And despite all the judgment and gossip still swirling through Pine Hollow, Clara knew he was right. They'd found each other in the cold and dark, two broken hearts learning to beat again. Everything else the Reverend's disapproval, the town's whispers was just noise. What mattered was this, the two of them, choosing love over fear, hope over judgment, a future together over the safety of solitude. It was more than enough. It was everything. The late summer heat shimmered over the ranch as Clara worked in the garden, harvesting the herbs that now grew abundant along the south wall. She hummed softly, a habit she'd developed over the months, the return of music to a house that had been silent too long. You sound happy, Jonas observed from where he was repairing the garden fence. Clara smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. I am happy, despite everything. Despite everything, he agreed, his eyes warm. They'd settled into a routine of quiet courtship over the past weeks. Evening walks along the creek, shared meals that stretched long with conversation, small touches that spoke volumes. Jonas had carved her a wooden box for her few treasures. She'd sewn him new work shirts that actually fit, small acts of care that built toward something larger. But the town's pressure hadn't eased. If anything, their public declaration of intent to marry had intensified the scrutiny. Just yesterday, Clara had overheard two women at the Mercantile discussing whether she'd trapped Jonas with feminine wiles. Let me carry that, Jonas said now, taking the herb basket from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and he held on a moment longer than necessary. Inside, Clara set water to boil for tea while Jonas washed at the pump. She watched him through the window, the careful way he moved, still favoring the shoulder he'd hurt in the spring storm. He was a good man, steady and true. She'd known that from the first night, but now she knew the depths of it. Clara. He'd come in quietly, standing uncertain in the doorway of his own kitchen. There's something I want to show you. Curious. She followed him to the main bedroom, the room he'd shared with Martha, where Clara had never ventured except to clean. He opened a drawer in the tall dresser and pulled out a small leather pouch. This was Martha's, he said, spilling the contents into his palm. A simple gold wedding band gleamed in the afternoon light. Her mother's before her. I'd like you to have it, if you want. Clara's breath caught. Jonas, I couldn't. She would want it used, not hidden away. He took her hand, cradling it gently. You brought love back to this house. That deserves honoring. What about Rebecca? Shouldn't it go to... Clara's voice broke. Rebecca's gone, Jonas said softly but firmly. You're here. You're real. You're the future. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting. Clara stared at the simple band, tears blurring her vision. Your first wife's ring? Won't people talk more?
Let them.
Jonas tilted her chin up. Martha believed in practical grace, in things being used and loved, not hoarded. She'd approve. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Clara kept touching the ring, still amazed by the weight of it. Not just the gold, but the history, the trust, the letting go and holding on all at once. Tell me about your wedding, she said suddenly. To Martha, Jonas looked surprised but not upset. Simple ceremony, her father's farm. She wore her mother's dress and wildflowers in her hair. I was so nervous I nearly said my vows backwards. Clara smiled at the image. Were you happy? Very. He reached for her hand, thumb rubbing over the ring. Different kind of happy than now, but happy. Different how? Jonas considered. Then, I was a young man who'd never lost anything that mattered. Everything was possibility and promise. He squeezed her fingers. Now I know how precious it all is, how quick it can go, makes every moment sharper, more real. They sat quietly, watching the stars emerge. Then Clara said, I want a simple wedding too, just us and the few who truly wish us well. Not the Reverend. Tom Garrett could officiate. He's a justice of the peace. Clara had been thinking about this. Sarah could stand with me. Maybe the Mullers, the Chens, the people who see us true. Jonas nodded slowly. When? Soon, Clara said firmly. I'm tired of waiting for the town's permission to live our lives. Saturday. His voice held hope and uncertainty in equal measure. Saturday, she agreed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Clara was kneading bread when she heard horses, multiple horses, moving fast. Through the window, she saw 4 men dismounting, led by Reverend Hartwell.
Jonas,
she called, but he was already emerging from the barn, pitchfork in hand. Gentlemen, Jonas said evenly. What brings you here? The moral decay of this community, Hartwell announced. We've come to deliver an ultimatum. Clara stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. The men's eyes went immediately to the ring on her finger, and she saw Hartwell's face darken.
You dare wear a sacred ring while living in sin? He thundered.
I wear a gift from my intended, Clara replied calmly. Given with love and received with honor.
Enough, one of the other men,
Mr. Blackwood, who owned the bank, stepped forward. Merrick, be reasonable. This situation affects us all. Families are divided. Business relationships strained. Marry the woman properly or send her away.
We are marrying,
Jonas said. Saturday. Tom Garrett officiating. A civil ceremony? Hartwell looked appalled. Without the church's blessing, your church turned this woman away to freeze. Jonas's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Your blessing means nothing to us. Then you leave us no choice. Blackwood straightened his coat. Any man who continues doing business with you will face consequences. Credit called in, contracts canceled. You'll be isolated, Merrick. Both of you. Clara felt Jonas tense beside her, knowing what this meant. His lumber business supported them. Without it.
So be it, Jonas said firmly. Now get off my land.
The men left in a cloud of dust and threats. Clara found she was shaking not with fear, but with anger. They can't do this, she said. They can. Jonas set down the pitchfork, suddenly looking tired. And they will. Blackwood holds paper on half the businesses in town. Then we'll leave, start over somewhere. No. Jonas pulled her into his arms. This is our home, our land. I won't let them drive us out. But how will we survive if no one will buy from you? He was quiet for a moment. Then, there are other towns, other markets. It'll be harder, traveling further, but possible. He pulled back to look at her. Question is, are you willing to fight for this for us? Clara thought of all she'd survived her uncle's cruelty, her mother's death, that frozen alley. She'd endured worse than small-minded men with small-minded threats. I'm not going anywhere, she said fiercely. Word of the ultimatum spread quickly. By afternoon, they had visitors, but not the kind they expected. Tom and Sarah Garrett arrived first. Heard what Blackwood pulled, Tom said without preamble. Want you to know not everyone agrees? I'll still buy your lumber. And I'll marry you Saturday with pride. Old Mr. Muller came next, bringing fresh bread. I remember when my family first came here. The English, they wanted us gone too, but we stayed. You stay too. Mrs. Chen brought fabric for a wedding dress. The Johansons offered use of their wagon for hauling lumber to distant towns, one by one. The quiet rebels of Pine Hollow made their choice. More than I expected, Jonas said that evening, moved by the support. Good people recognize good people. Clara replied, even in hard times, especially in hard times. She worked on her wedding dress by lamplight while Jonas planned new timber routes. Not the wedding preparation either had imagined, but somehow fitting for who they were, two people who'd learned to build happiness from whatever materials life provided. Clara, Jonas said suddenly, that first night, in the barn, you said you'd freeze quietly. Do you remember? Every word, she admitted. I think about it sometimes. How you chose dignity over comfort. How you were ready to die rather than sacrifice who you were. He set down his pencil. That's when I started loving you. I think before I even knew your name. Clara's needle stilled. They'd danced around the word for weeks, both knowing but neither saying. I love you too, she said simply. Started when you covered me with horse blankets and didn't ask for anything in return. He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. We'll get through this, Clara. The threats, the boycotts, all of it. I know. She touched his face, rough with evening stubble. We've survived worse separately. Together, she smiled. Together we're unbreakable. Saturday dawned clear and bright. Clara dressed in the simple blue dress Mrs. Chen had helped her make. Sarah Garrett wove wildflowers into her hair, tears streaming down her face. You're beautiful, Sarah declared, and brave, so brave. The ceremony was held in the Garrett's garden, with a small gathering of true friends as witness. Jonas wore his good suit and an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. Tom Garrett spoke simple words about love and commitment, about choosing each other not just once, but daily. When he asked for objections, there was a moment of held breath had the Reverend's faction come to disrupt, but only birdsong filled the silence. I, Jonas Michael Merrick, take you, Clara May Rutledge, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Jonas said, his voice strong and sure. I, Clara May Rutledge, take you, Jonas Michael Merrick, to be my lawfully wedded husband. Clara replied, meaning every word down to her bones. The ring, Martha's ring, now hers, gleamed in the sunlight as Jonas slipped it back on her finger, this time as her wedding band. By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Tom grinned. Jonas, kiss your bride. The kiss was sweet, tender, and met with applause from their small but fierce congregation of supporters. As they walked back through town to the ranch, their ranch now curtains twitched and faces appeared in windows. Some turned away, but others nodded, smiled, raised hands in quiet blessing. No regrets, Jonas asked as they reached their door. None, Clara said firmly. You. Instead of answering, he swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold. Welcome home, Mrs. Merrick. She laughed, the sound bright as the sunshine. I've been home for months. No, he corrected, setting her down gently in their kitchen. Now you're home. Now we both are. And despite the challenges ahead, The boycotts and gossip and small-minded cruelties, Clara knew he was right. They were home, in all the ways that mattered. Together, they'd weather whatever storms came. After all, they'd found each other in the midst of winter's worst. Everything else was just details. The first snow of winter fell softly on their wedding night, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Clara stood at the bedroom window, wrapped in a quilt, watching the familiar landscape transform. Behind her, she heard Jonas stirring. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. "Just thinking." She turned to smile at him. "A year ago, I was on that train, heading here with such hope. Never imagined I'd end up here like this." Jonas rose and joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Disappointed?" "No." She leaned back against his solid warmth. "Grateful. For all of it, even the hard parts. They led me to you." They stood quietly, watching the snow fall. The house around them was warm, secure, filled with the small touches Clara had added over the month's herbs drying from the rafters. New curtains at the windows, the smell of bread rising for morning. "Jonas," Clara said softly, "where can I sleep?" He smiled against her hair, understanding the echo of their beginning. "Here," he murmured. "Always here." The boycott made the following weeks challenging. True to Blackwood's threat, many of Jonas's regular customers suddenly found reasons to buy elsewhere, but also true to their word. The Garretts, Mullers, and others stood firm. Jonas had to travel farther to sell lumber, sometimes gone for days, but they managed. Clara kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively. She expanded the garden, planning for next year's harvest. She took in mending from Sarah Garrett's friends in neighboring towns, earning extra money with her neat stitches. She made the ranch not just survivable, but thriving. One evening in early December, Jonas returned from a lumber run to find the house glowing with lamplight and smelling of cinnamon. Clara had made preserves from the late apples, and fresh bread cooled on the counter. "Welcome home," she called from the stove, not turning around. "Supper's almost ready." Jonas crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Missed you? Missed you too." She leaned into him for a moment before returning to stirring. "How was the trip?" "Good. Sold everything to the mine operation 2 towns over. They want regular deliveries." He squeezed her gently. "We're going to be fine." "Clara." "I know." And she did. They'd built something stronger than the town's disapproval. After supper, they sat by the fire, Clara mending one of his shirts while Jonas worked on accounts. The comfortable silence between them was broken by a knock at the door. They exchanged glances. Visitors after dark were rarely good news. Jonas opened the door to find Reverend Hartwell standing in the snow, but not as Clara had ever seen him. His usual rigid posture was slumped, his face haggard. "My wife," he said without preamble. "She's taken ill. Very ill. The doctor says—" His voice broke. "I've come to ask your wife's help." Clara was already reaching for her shawl. "Of course. Let me get my remedies." "Clara," Jonas said quietly, a warning in his tone. She understood. This man had tried to destroy them, but she also understood desperation, the fear of losing someone beloved. "I took vows," she said simply, "to love and honor, but also older vows to help where I can. My mother would haunt me if I turned away from someone in need." She gathered her herbs and tinctures, the knowledge passed down from her mother and Mrs. Nguyen. Jonas hitched the wagon, insisting on driving them both. The parsonage was in chaos. Mrs. Hartwell lay fevered and struggling to breathe. Clara recognized the signs immediately: lung fever, serious but not hopeless if treated quickly. She worked through the night, preparing poultices, brewing teas, showing the Reverend's daughters how to help. Jonas stayed too, keeping the fire going, hauling water, his quiet strength a comfort. By dawn, Mrs. Hartwell's breathing had eased. The fever broke near noon. When she finally opened clear eyes, Clara nearly wept with relief. "You saved her," Reverend Hartwell said, standing in his kitchen looking lost. "After everything Why?" "Because that's what decent people do." Clara replied simply, "They help, whether or not they deserve it." The Reverend's face crumpled. "I've been so wrong, so very wrong." Clara touched his shoulder gently. "Pride's a harder illness than lung fever, Reverend, but it can be cured too, with effort." Word spread quickly about Clara's actions. The woman the Reverend had called a Jezebel had saved his wife's life. The moral certainties that had seemed so clear began to waver. The following Sunday, Reverend Hartwell stood in his pulpit and did something unprecedented. He apologized. "I have sinned," he began, his voice carrying clearly, "not in the ways I accused others of, but in pride, in judgment, in failing to show Christ's love." He looked directly at Jonas and Clara. "I humbly ask forgiveness from those I've wronged." The congregation sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Willoughby looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, but many others began to nod. After the service, people approached Jonas and Clara differently. Tentative smiles, quiet words of support. The ice of the boycott began to crack. "Don't trust it," Jonas warned quietly as they walked home. "People don't change that easy." But Clara had seen the look in Hartwell's eyes. "Some do," she said, "when life shows them what really matters." The winter passed more gently after that. The boycott gradually dissolved as people found excuses to resume business with Jonas. Clara's herb garden became a source of remedies for the town. She never turned anyone away, regardless of how they'd treated her before. Spring arrived with its usual mixture of mud and promise. Clara stood in her garden, now expanded and thriving, planning the season's planting. She had one hand on her belly, where new life had just begun to make itself known. "Dreaming of summer vegetables?" Jonas asked, joining her. "Dreaming of lots of things." She took his hand, placing it over hers. "Jonas, we're going to have a harvest of more than herbs this year." His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Clara, are you—" "Late November, I think." She watched joy transform his face. "Are you happy?" Instead of answering, he swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing. When he set her down, his eyes were wet. "I thought I'd never, after Martha and the children, I thought that part of my life was over." "Nothing's over," Clara said softly. "It just changes shape, makes room for new things while honoring the old." They stood together in their garden, holding each other and their secret close. The town that had once tried to tear them apart would soon witness new life born from the love they'd fought to protect. That evening, as they sat on the porch Jonas had built, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. A frozen alley, a desperate choice, a man who'd offered shelter without price. They'd built a love not on passion's fire, but on kindness's steady warmth. "No regrets?" Jonas asked, as he often did. "Only one," Clara said, making him look at her in alarm. "I wish Mama could have met you. She would have loved you." "She raised you," Jonas said simply. "I already know she was remarkable." As darkness fell, they went inside together, their house truly theirs now, filled with shared memories and future plans. In the kitchen, Clara's herbs scented the air. In the parlor, Jonas's woodworking projects waited, in the small room that had been Rebecca's. Soon, a cradle would stand. "Clara," Jonas said as they prepared for bed, "that night in the barn, you asked where you could sleep. And you said here," Clara finished, smiling at the memory. "Best answer I ever gave." He pulled her close. "To the best question anyone ever asked me." Outside, Pine Hollow slept peacefully. The woman who'd once been turned away from every door had become part of the town's fabric. her healing hands and generous heart slowly mending what fear and judgment had torn. And in the house that had once echoed with grief, 2 hearts beat in rhythm 3, if you counted the tiny one just beginning. Love had come not as rescue but as choice, not as perfection but as persistence. Clara May Merrick, who'd once been willing to freeze quietly rather than compromise her dignity, now lived loudly in her joy. She'd found more than shelter from the cold. She'd found home. And that, she thought, as sleep claimed her, safe in Jonas's arms, was worth every frozen night, every harsh word, every struggle that had led her here. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The baby would come, bringing joy and fear in equal measure. The town would continue its slow evolution toward acceptance. Life would unfold in its mysterious ways. But tonight, Clara was exactly where she belonged, where she could always sleep, where love lived not in grand gestures but in small kindnesses, accumulated like snow until they transformed the landscape entirely. "Here," she whispered into the darkness, answering her own long-ago question one final time. "Always here." Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in Clara, Owen, and Jonas's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of love triumphing over judgment, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover this story of hope, resilience, and the power of choosing love over fear. Until our next adventure in the Old West, remember sometimes the coldest nights lead us to the warmest homes.